Now that I have 10 recordings in the book and I've talked about a lot of different things at the Walt Disney World Resort, it's time to reflect back on the first 10 Lost and Found at Disney World episodes and kind of critique myself a little bit and talk about some of the things that I got right, maybe some of the things that I could have done a little better, and then point out some of the things that I didn't put in the podcast, in the video cast, because maybe there wasn't space, maybe I didn't have a piece of information or a particular picture. So let's go back and look at those few things and see what they look like. In episode 1, my introduction to this whole Lost and Found series, I think I did a pretty good job of expressing what the series is about. I don't have any major complaints or concerns about anything that I did or didn't say in this case. I think it pretty well introduces the topic and sums up some of the things that I'm thinking. But here's a couple of additional clips that didn't make the final cut that I think you might enjoy. So as I note, one of the things that's important here to understand is that he had this idea for the experimental prototype city. It was going to be this place that was the research park, this place where he could bring businesses in and have other people working here and doing things. But I think Disney always understood that he had the problem of not having permanent residents. If you have your land and you're using it, permanent residents create issues for you because now you have to deal with the residents and what they're going to do in the property because they have landowner rights. So Disney had to find a clever way around it. Now Disney had studied land planning and knew a lot of people who did land planning, so he had some ideas, but I don't think they ever came to fruition because unfortunately he died before the property was ever developed. But at least he had the ideas and the concepts and he kind of thought it through and had the conceptual things laid out. And had he lived on, I would have been interested to see what he would have actually done. This would have probably become some sort of a working town, where people would be here for 6 months to a year for some contract working for some large corporation that had an affiliation with Disney. The people would move here with their families, they would live here for some period of time, and then once their contracts were up, they'd move on to their next job and do the next thing. Now, would that have actually worked? Who knows? I have no idea. But Disney needed to get some very specific land planning approval. He needed to have the land rights to the property and be able to control it in a way that I don't think anyone had in mind at the time. He had some things that he would have to do, and I will talk about that in a future podcast as well. But think about all of this property and how he wanted to use it and how he planned to use up the property and make sure that it was usable for him in the way that he wanted to use it. Would have been very difficult, but I think he had the right ideas. Episode 2, the land acquisition. This one was probably the most complete piece I put together. It was the most fun, too, to learn about all the history and actually talk about some of the very specific things. And I think I pretty well covered the topic of how he acquired the land from the brothers and from Earl Bronson down in Kissimmee. So that was most of the land that he had. Now, I didn't talk about the very specific other parcels of land that the land acquisition companies went in and bought because I thought that they were not as interesting to talk about in the way that he got them. But it was the same principle. They went in and they purchased up the land for various uses from smaller developers in that case, or smaller land speculators. I did miss one thing, and that is that there's another window in the Magic Kingdom that's dedicated to the land acquisition, and I forgot to include that. So here's a picture of that particular window along Main Street. That's a great way to look at it because they took up so many pseudonyms along the way. In episode 3 about the reveal, this was a kind of an interesting story that needed to be told about Emily Baver and her relationship to the Disney company and her connection to Walt Disney in that sense, and how this all came together. Now, the interesting piece to this puzzle is that Walt Disney himself actually didn't stay at the Cherry Plaza Hotel. In fact, it was not considered a posh hotel at that point in time. It was considered a lower-end hotel, so he didn't stay there. He was actually staying in another hotel around the corner, the Robert Meyer Motor Inn. And incidentally, there's another note to this story that General Joe Potter, one of the chief architects in charge of building the Disney property, was actually staying at that same hotel on the night that the news broke in the Orlando Sentinel that Walt Disney was the mystery buyer. So kind of a funny little thing that he was already there at that point. Episode 4, Economics and Politics. I thought this was an important episode to kind of present along the way and talk about why it was important to Florida, why it was important to the Disney company, and so forth, and kind of capture the nature of what this relationship was going to be all about. Now, a couple of additional notes that kind of fit somewhere between the land acquisition, the economics and politics, and the next video cast, where I talk about the autonomy pitch. The first is that Walt Disney's parents actually lived in Florida in a small town that was just north of Orlando, kind of closer to Ocala. The town no longer exists. It was a blip on a map that eventually went out of business and went bankrupt, and now it's just been absorbed into some larger community. But they lived there for some period of time. So there was this tighter connection than I even realized about Walt Disney wanting to come to Florida and wanting to build a property here, because there was a connection, a draw for him that historically his parents actually lived and worked here at some point in time before they had children. The other interesting thing that was going on here was that Hayden Burns was the governor at the time that Walt Disney came here and was purchasing the land. And he wanted to draw on the whole Walt Disney experience and make it part of what he was doing. So he developed that short video I showed where he was talking about the economic development. Now, he was looking for re-election the following term, but he actually encountered some problems. One of the problems was he was really interested in development and building Florida up into something else, something greater. And some of the other candidates in the state weren't so big on that. And some of the other politicians weren't as interested as he was in doing some of the things like that, where the state would get overdeveloped and be selling off parts of its own history. Now, it is a tourist-driven economy, so it is kind of important that he did do this. But on the other side, he had a challenger during his primary and lost his primary and was not even on the ballot for the general election. So enter Claude Kirk, who embraced the idea of taking Walt Disney to heart and wanted to actually develop more with Walt Disney and do some things. Now, Walt Disney did say of Governor Burns, he's a great man, a fine man who gets things done. So that sounds to me like Walt Disney kind of had him in his hip pocket and really was able to use him to an advantage that he wanted to be able to take advantage of everything that Florida had to offer and be able to get something he wanted. Now, that leads me into episode 5, the autonomy pitch. The autonomy pitch is one of those interesting things that happened where the Walt Disney Company brought together some of the best and brightest minds, other companies and industries that could benefit from Walt Disney having a sort of a think tank, a sort of a research park of a sort, and could actually use that to their advantage. They brought in these companies, and if you look at some of the promotional videos they did and some of the things that they talked about, even U.S. Steel's commercial for the Contemporary, it's about building for the future. It's not about a theme park. So in doing those kinds of things, the Disney company was able to really sell the local politicians in Florida in really being able to create whatever they wanted, to create their own space, because they would bring jobs, because they would bring industry, because they would bring money, and they would bring tourists. It's a win on every angle, so I can understand why Governor Kirk was so excited to be a part of this. And several other politicians in the state were likewise brought in and thought very highly of this idea because they were, I won't use the word duped because that's not fair, but they were believers in the idea. Now, there's a kind of a funny picture. There were only so many hotels in town, and there wasn't that much space for everybody. So the Holiday Inn was one of the more famous hotels in town. So they actually put this up on their marquee the night before they met. Episode 6, construction begins. I wanted to kind of show the undertaking that they had here, that they had to dredge out the swampland and make the Seven Seas Lagoon because there was swampy areas there, and they really had to work very hard to make it work the way they wanted it to. The Magic Kingdom is raised up 90 feet above sea level because that's where they took the land from, the fill that they took out of the Seven Seas Lagoon. So they actually made a second level there to make sure the ground was safe and structurally sound. So an interesting thing, and it was really an interesting development. There was a lot of things going on there. I think there is more story to tell here about the construction, and I'll have to do that in a future video cast. But I think I got the nature of it down, and I think it gave a pretty good perspective on how it came together. Episode 7, Jaques' Happy Corner. This was one that just caught my attention when I realized what this was and where this location was. And I just found it fascinating that there was a location there that really did do something different, that really was unique. There isn't much more to say about that location. I just thought it was kind of an interesting place in the perspective of everything, and I wanted to share that with you. Episode 8, the Southern Border. I wanted to tell the story about part of the land that they got from Earlo Bronson and how they were able to build up some of the property in that area. I think there is more story to tell here about 192 or Earlo Bronson Memorial Highway, And I'll tell that along the way in future videos, but I wanted to kind of capture the feeling of what it was like on that southern border. And the fact that it still has a certain feel to it that's similar to the way it was 40 years ago. It's evolved and certainly grown, but you still have that feeling like this is the southern border. This is where the Disney company was doing a lot of their work. And this was the land that was actually owned by the cattle ranchers. And this is where there was an airfield down in this area. And of course, I'll get to that in a future video as well, but just giving you a little teaser there. Episode 9, the Preview Center. I actually thought this one came together pretty well. It's a nice little review of what the Preview Center was, where the location is, and the fact that the building is still there and used for other purposes is kind of interesting. Standing on the steps and thinking about all the people that went through there and all the things that happened to kind of sell the idea of Walt Disney World to the general public is kind of interesting. Now, episode 10, Hotel Plaza Boulevard. This was the one that gave me the most fits. I really wanted to tell the story of Hotel Plaza Boulevard, but I couldn't figure out how to tell the story. It's kind of hard because the tree line makes it difficult to see all the hotels. It's kind of hard to talk to what they actually meant. This was a property that Disney owned that they leased out to various hotel chains so they could run the property. The Walt Disney Company had never been in the hotel business before. So one easy way around it was to go ahead and create some hotels on Hotel Plaza Boulevard that would be additional resource hotels, additional supply of hotels for the area that would allow people to stay there, be close, because as I said, there weren't a lot of hotels in the Central Florida area except near very specific population bases. So it would be nice to have a couple of hotels there where people who lived and worked and did other things with the Walt Disney Company could stay and actually be involved in different things. So those were the 4 hotels that were there. But you see how sort of the idea of Hotel Plaza Boulevard is really richer than just the 4 hotels that were there. I don't tell the story in enough detail. This is probably the video that I feel the least confident about, that I really didn't love in the same way. Some of them I really enjoyed making. This one I had a little trouble with. And I think I have to tell more pieces to the story to help fill it in and make it sound a little better. It just didn't quite work the way it was. But I think it's okay. I think it still serves a purpose in terms of Disney history. So there you go. There are my first 10 video casts. I hope you've enjoyed what I've done so far. And please do feel free to leave me comments. And if you like my videos, don't forget to hit the like button along the way. And if you're enjoying yourself, go ahead and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming.